Let's go back to Len. Len started another company called Network General. Tell us how that evolved and how evidently the acquisition of that company made you financially set so you can concentrate on volunteer activities like being the go-to guy for the Computer History Museum.
Well, when we sold Nestar to DSC in '86, Harry Sal and I decided to start over again and start a company. We took out of Nestar the rights to build a piece of test equipment that we had generated within the engineering department for our own use. It was called the sniffer. It was a device that allowed you to look inside a local area network and figure out why it wasn't working. Most of the time it wasn't working. This helped you figure out why. So we started a company called Network General to build these sniffers, and we had overnight success. It was amazing because people were trying to deploy these networks that were very difficult to get working, and they had no tools. So we gave them a tool. So the company went public in 1989, 3 years later, when we had 29 employees, I think, something like that. It was a rocket ship. By the time I decided to step down, we had merged. We had grown to about 1,000 employees. I can't remember the revenues. We had merged with McAfee Associates, the virus company, and with PGP. So there was a three-way merger, which I was not in favor of, and eventually turned out not to have been a good idea. But after the merger, I decided to take off. And this was about 1994. I decided to go back to my first career, which is teaching. So instead of going back to Pittsburgh, once in Pittsburgh was enough, I decided to teach at Stanford.
Pittsburgh was Carnegie Mellon?
Pittsburgh was Carnegie Mellon. So I decided to teach at Stanford. So I started teaching computer architecture at Stanford.
And how did that go?
It went quite well. I taught the same course, EE282, that I had taken from Ed McCluskey 25 years earlier. A lot had changed because in 25 years the computer industry had moved on, but one of the things that changed disturbed me, which is that all of the history had been erased from the curriculum. You know, we learned about how to do paging by studying the Atlas computer from Manchester, and that was the first machine that did virtual memory. But all of that was gone from the curriculum.
Was that the spark that caused you to be so passionate about computer history and think, hey, you know, there aren't any computer history museums in the world, really aren't. We ought to start one.
Well, I didn't know that. I didn't know there weren't any. All I knew was that there wasn't one in Silicon Valley. So
Or all of California, for that matter.
My plan, I knew Silicon Valley, there wasn't one. This was the center of the world for computers at that point. How come there isn't a museum? So I figured that was going to be my retirement project. I was going to start a museum of computers in Silicon Valley. And I figured surely there must be other museums that I can model mine on. So I started traveling around the US and in fact the world. I went to the Deutsches Museum and the London Science Museum looking for the computer museums that I could model mine on. And I discovered that there weren't any, except for one. And that was the one that Gordon Bell had started in Boston.
And how did you tie in with him? How did you get to meet him?
I called up Gwen Bell in Boston saying, this is who I am. I want to start a computer museum. Can I come look at yours? And she said, sure, and invited me to come to Boston and meet with her. I had never met Gordon Bell. I knew him as a legend, but I had never met him. And I went to Boston. I also went to the Smithsonian on that trip. But I discovered what had happened in Boston, which was that they had started to do exactly what I wanted to do back in 1978, which was a museum dedicated to the history of computing. But by 1994-95, the computer industry had left Boston. They had a hard time getting funding, and they were gradually morphing into a kids' museum. They built this big walk-through computer, and kids would be climbing on the mouse, and it's all great stuff. I have nothing wrong. I have no objection to getting kids interested in computing by doing that. But that wasn't the original mission. And by the way, there was a perfectly fine kids museum just a little bit away called the Museum of Science in Boston, and so they were competing on their turf. So I don't know if you want me to continue with that story, but that's.
I think we'll save that. I think you have a presentation on it.
Yeah, I have some slides I can show.
Right. So at that point in time, you decided that you didn't want to return to Stanford to be. Were you adjunct professor there? Or on the tenure track?
I don't know what I was not tenure track.
Okay, then you're
I-
adjunct or instructor or
Right.
whatever. Like myself, I was 18 years at Santa Clara University, but never on the tenure track. So you decided that your passion really was computer history as opposed to teaching computer science, and you would attempt to pursue that.
Well, I thought it was like my leave of absence from
This
Carnegie
was about
Mellon to start
1995,
Nestar.
1996?
This is about 95, 96.
Yeah.
I thought it was like my leave of absence to leave Carnegie Mellon to start the company. I figured it would be a couple of years and then I'd go back. I figured starting the museum would be a couple of years and then I'd go back, maybe to start another company or maybe to go back to teaching at Stanford. Well, it was 18 years ago and I'm still with the museum.